My name is Will Day Brosnan, and I work in the school attendance policy team. This is the second of a number of school and trust good practice attendance webinars that we're looking to run. And I'm very pleased to be joined this afternoon by Michelle O'Dell and Mike Donoghue, who are the Attendance Intervention Manager and the Chief Executive Officer of the John Taylor Multi-Academy Trust, respectively. So Michelle and Mike are going to be talking about their experience managing attendance across a number of their schools and the approach that they take as a trust. But before I pass over to them to kind of kick off the substance of the webinar, there are a couple of bits of housekeeping, if you will, that I wanted to quickly run through. So there'll be a short 10-minute question and answer session at the end of this presentation. So please submit any questions via the kind of tab on the right hand side of your screen, and then we'll put a number of the most relevant questions to Michelle and to Mike at the end of the session. We've also got a number of further attendance, best practice, good practice webinars planned for the rest of this term. And we're trying to make sure that we hear from a range of schools and trusts in different contexts in different parts of the country so that they can share what they're doing. So if you're interested in kind of listening to some of those webinars as well, you'll find the links to register, I think, on the right hand side of your screen, or at least you should be able to access those shortly. So next week we'll be running a session with Ofsted, looking at the findings of a research report that they published earlier this week on attendance. And we've also got a secondary school in Stoke talking about their approach to managing attendance and absence during the pandemic and before the pandemic. So sign up to those webinars if you're interested. Third thing I wanted to mention is that we're intending to record all of these webinars, and we've set up a page on .gov.uk for people to access the recordings, and that also includes the session that we ran with North Shore Academy, which is part of the Northern Education Trust, and that was a session that we ran before Christmas. And then the final thing, we're keen to get some feedback about this webinar, and also to understand what would be helpful actually, what would be helpful for people that have joined that are listening in for us to cover in future sessions. So at the end of this webinar, we'd be grateful if you could fill in a short feedback form for us, which will also be available on the right hand side of your screen. I think that's everything from me for now. So thanks again to everyone for dialing in, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Mike, who is going to briefly introduce the trust and a bit about the context of the trust.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Donoghue, CEO of John Taylor Matt, and yeah, it's a real pleasure to join you this afternoon. So John Taylor Multi-Academy Trust comprises 14 schools at present, 10 primary phase schools, 7 of which are one form of entry or smaller. Many of them are in a rural context, and 4 soon to be 5 secondary schools in addition to that. The role of attendance intervention manager is something that predates the pandemic, and Michelle, who will be talking to you for the majority of this session, has been working with us for several years on the management of our attendance and absence. We operate across 2 local authorities and 3 local authority districts, and the watchword really in terms of everything that we try and do with regard to attendance and other matters really is around compliance and excellence. And when it comes to compliance, Michelle's role is really important in terms of supporting when it comes to statutory returns and making sure that we adhere to everything that we are obliged to in terms of our duty of care, and that involves obviously the management of attendance and absence, and making sure that all of our systems and structures are in place, and that we're responsive to any changes in legislation or changes in departmental guidance for that. But when it comes to excellence, the importance of making sure that we have high quality support for our schools, for our families and for their communities, and that we are consistent. And the attendance intervention manager role was born out of that need for consistency. The 10 primary schools and the 4 secondary schools are in quite a tight geographical footprint. and many of the primary schools are partner primaries for the secondaries. And those of you who are involved in the management of attendance in such a context will understand that inconsistency of approach with families who have children in several schools is highly problematic for our schools and obviously for families as well. So Michelle's role is a really important one for us. It's one that has become increasingly important through the pandemic and the demands that have been placed upon it. And Michelle's going to talk to you now. We're actually in the same office. We've decided that rather than try and beam in separately, we've gone old school, and we're just going to move seats in a minute. But Michelle will talk you through our procedures, the context around them, and hopefully you'll find it useful in your own context and your own work. So I'm going to invite Michelle now to come and talk to us.
There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be here this afternoon to talk to you about attendance and what we perceive to be good practice across our trust. And I really do believe that attendance is the key to the cornerstone to everything that we do in schools. And as I talk this afternoon, when I use the term attendance, obviously I'm referring to absence and punctuality as well, because they're integral to attendance in school as well. Could we have the next slide, please? Mike's already touched on the makeup of our schools and our trusts. As you said, there was 14 schools within our trust, 10 primaries and 4 secondaries. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. And we are a growing trust, which is very exciting. And we've got new schools joining, and we have new schools that are being planned and being built as we speak. We have the next slide, please. I've included a little bit about my background and experience because I do feel that this is quite fundamental to my role in approaching the management of attendance in school. I won't read through all of it because I believe the slides will be available after this session. But I suppose what is quite key is that I've had 12 years experience as a primary head, and that's in a variety of settings, including small rural and large inner city, multicultural, highly deprived schools. And my passion was always maintaining or improving high levels of attendance across school, regardless of the phase, regardless of the age of the pupils that we served. And in 2 years in one of my schools raised attendance from 94 to 97% and reduced persistent absence by 2%. And I categorically believe that our improvement in standards and outcomes for pupils was partly as a direct consequence to improvement in attendance. Obviously there was work on teaching and learning and quality of provision as well, but I do believe that the majority of that was down to improved attendance. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So, as has already been said, my role is attendance intervention manager. I've spoken to Mike about possibly changing that title to support manager to align with the trust ethos of positivity, support and collaboration, which I think is important in managing attendance across schools. And sometimes those nuances of language can also have an impact on those relationships that we build with our staff and we build with our families. I was appointed in September 2020, so it's a very interesting time to undertake the role in the midst of a pandemic, and the role has probably evolved and changed as our landscape has ebbed and flowed over the last many months. Can I have the next slide, please? So Mark has already touched on this a little bit, so I'll put a little bit more information to that. I see the role as twofold, and consistency is definitely key, and accountability. So I hold schools to account for attendance. I couldn't think of a better term than hold to account. It sounds like a done-to process, and it most definitely isn't. It's much about collaboration. But in a very similar way as our school improvement partners work with our schools on outcomes and teaching and learning. A quality assure our systems, policies and procedures are implemented consistently, here's that word again, across all of our 14 schools. And I'm a point of advice and the consistent dissemination of information across all our head teachers and our attendance team. So nobody's missing that vital piece of information. and I deliver a CPD as well. The other side to my role is that I work with individual families and pupils to support school attendance. So that might be chairing a team around a family meeting, might be working with a pupil on a one-to-one basis, and out of that are born attendance support plans and, if necessary, parenting contracts that we can use as we proceed through the process. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, it's just, I'm not going to read through all that data, there is quite a lot there, but just a snapshot of what our attendance data looks like and how we target set going forward. Could I have the next slide, please? So generally, our attendance is in line or above national, and our persistent absence is in line or above. We always benchmark against national, not local, because we feel that's a more robust measure. And we have set our targets this year, aspirationally, to be in line with 2019, with the note that we know that's going to be heavily impacted by the COVID pandemic and those children that have been ill because of COVID. But we've kept that at the forefront of our minds, of that's where we're aspiring, that we at least want to try and work towards getting back to. We've identified our own areas for development and are looking at our EHC children and our pupils with social workers, and especially those with anxiety and mental health issues. And I'll talk about how we've addressed some of those issues a little bit later. Do you have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, just a little snapshot of our autumn term 2022 data. We have seen our data ebb and flow, particularly this term at the start of the academic year, because of the impact of COVID. We've been really hard hit this term in terms of our incidence of COVID positive cases, and we were above national and it was rising. Hopefully this week, and I'm touching wood as we speak, that we seem to be on a little bit of a downward trend with that, but we shall wait and see. Have the next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of our persistent absence does look high, as I think most schools are experiencing. What we have done is sat back and recalculated our persistent absence to try and get a truer reflection to enable us to be targeted in our support and intervention. So we've actually extracted from the data pupils who have tested positive for COVID, and that is the reason that they've fallen into persistent absence. Because of the way attendance is at the moment and the challenges that we face, we've had to really prioritise our resources in terms of support. And that's been a very useful tool, not only in being able to target our intervention, but actually also in terms of staff morale. Those teams that are dealing with attendance, is actually our attendance is more or less in line with our persistent absence, is more or less in line of where we were in 2019. So actually we are still doing something well. Can I have the next slide, please? We've also sat back to look at what we mean. What do we really mean by persistent absence in this landscape? And again, this has been really useful in helping us to develop our strategies and actions. I've put there in bracket, not excuses, because not making any judgments of anybody in the profession, but there is sometimes we hear, isn't it, where it's the pandemic, children, you know, that's why attendance is poor. So we've really tried to sit back and unpick all of that. So as you've said, we've got those pupils that have fallen into persistent absence due to testing positive for COVID. And I think this is something that many colleagues will concur with. We've got pupils and families who have new mental health issues, who are finding attending school a challenge, especially where the threshold for external support is incredibly high. Now we've got waiting lists for up to 2 years for CAMHS referrals. Pupils and families with pre-existing mental health issues which have been exacerbated. Pupils with lower immunity or long COVID who are ill more often or for longer. And that new mindset regarding the value of school, and that's our legacy of remote learning. And the new mindset of not attending school if you're slightly poorly. And again, that's the legacy of isolating if you're possibly symptomatic. And out of those, we've prioritised the areas that we've tried to address. Could I have the next slide, please? As I talk about some of the strategies we've used in a little bit more detail in a minute. So in terms of general attendance management, what I feel works well for us as a trust in terms of reflecting on how we are able to maintain high levels of attendance is actually, I think, my role, having an attendance intervention manager as part of the central team responsible for attendance across the trust is key. And sitting behind that is that I have an individual action plan for the work that I'm going to be carrying out. I am performance managed and I report monthly to the CEO and a trust board. So there's a lot of accountability and professional appropriate challenge for the work that I'm carrying out. I feel that the trust places the same value on attendance as it does for curriculum outcomes. It's part of every school's framework of effectiveness. That's their self-evaluation process. And as I said, it's appropriately supported and challenged by the CEO and the trust board. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, we have a trust-wide attendance policy. Our schools do not have individual attendance policies, and all of our schools are expected to adhere to that. That means that we are able to ensure that our monitoring and moderation of the implementation of that policy is robust. So we're ensuring that our systems and procedures that we've got in place are embedded across our schools. We have a trust-wide graduated response to attendance management, and behind that, it's template letters, formats, even down to scripts for staff to be able to use when meeting with pupils and parents. We're very aware about schools having their own autonomy, but in terms of managing attendance, this is something that has worked particularly well. And in actual fact, our schools have welcomed that they've got a very clear process. This was put together in collaboration with the schools. Some of it drawn from a lot of the work that our secondaries were doing that we've implemented in our primaries. So they have been involved in putting that process together. I collect attendance data every half term from each school. That includes for our vulnerable pupils, those vulnerable groups. We've also become very aware of our own identified vulnerable groups, and at the moment we're monitoring our attendance of our LGBTQT children. That presents its own challenges in how we benchmark those children to that group. At the moment we're doing that informally with an awareness. But it's something that we are keeping an eye on. That data that is collected is I review that and is RAG rated and then reported back to the head teachers and where necessary SENCOs, pupil premium leads, DSLs, goes back to the CEO, the trust board and to our school improvement partners. That's because that then gives them that layer of being able to go in and talk about the relationship between attendance and outcomes. Each school then has a termly attendance review meeting. Could I have the next slide, please? And that happens at least termly, more frequently if needed. And there's a clear structure to those meetings. So the schools know when we go in and we have these discussions, and as I said, it's a very collaborative approach. We have a professional dialogue about work towards targets, our comparisons to national data and the attendance of our vulnerable groups. And we don't just look at whether those vulnerable groups are above national levels, we also look at the gap between our vulnerable groups and their peers. So in a school we might have pupil premium attendance that is above national pupil premium attendance, but there's a wider gap between those and their peers, and we're looking at how we can narrow that gap. We do our plan do review process in terms of actions and interventions. And that would even go down to the level at looking at individual pupils and what's working and what's not working, and whether I need to step in and be part of that intervention and support process. Could I have the next slide, please? I think there's very joined up thinking at a central level, and this has become even more apparent during the pandemic. And that is to ensure that we keep our schools open and no learning time is lost. So the COVID absence data I share with the estates manager, which then may prompt him to review a school's risk assessments or their health and safety procedures and see if there's any additional support required in a school in terms of managing COVID. The CEO, the finance team and the HR teams in supporting schools was related to staff sickness absence and things like insurance claims and preempting the impact of isolation guidance on staffing. And as I said previously, the half-termly data is shared with our school improvement partners to enable them to support and appropriately challenge. And I feel, I can only speak for what goes on in our trust, I think that's quite an unusual process to happen within a trust central team. So it's real proper joined up thinking, in my opinion, that all adds to the process of promoting high attendance in our schools. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So targets are set each year for our individual schools, and these are reviewed termly, again more frequently if needed. That is for overall attendance, including for vulnerable groups and for persistent absence. Action plans for improvement are developed, but that is on an individual school basis. It would depend whether that was deemed necessary. We don't have an action plan if one is not required. You know, if we've got a school where everybody's sitting at 98% and there's no difference between vulnerable groups, I'm not going to ask them to write an action plan. Might be asking them to share good practice though. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So at a school level, when I sat back and reflected on what was working well across our trust, there is a very similar approach in primaries and secondaries, regardless of size or demographic, whether they've got high levels of deprivation or not. There is a direct correlation between the ethos and culture in our schools and those with high levels of attendance. And actually, one of the schools that I'm bearing in mind is one that has got high levels of deprivation and high levels of pupil premium who are managing attendance well. The first thing is that attendance is a high priority, and I've put there that this can be triangulated by pupil voice, stakeholder voice, that they're not just saying attendance is a high priority. Actually, on the ground, when you walk into school, it's tangible that attendance is a high priority and it's a focus for them. It's part of their school development plan, and their systems and processes are consistently adhered to by all staff. And I've underlined all there, and this links with clear communication to all staff regarding actions in place, and that might even come down to that the ethos, the procedures, the strategies that are in place are shared with the premises staff, because that might be the person that a pupil coming into school, a family coming into school, first has contact with as they come through the gate in the morning. And it might be the approach that we use to welcoming our pupils into school, that everybody is buying into that. When I say everybody, I mean everybody. Head teachers and members of the senior leadership teams attend the review meetings. Quite often, sometimes we see that attendance becomes a little bit of an admin task, and our admin teams are amazing at what they do, but having head teacher or member of SLT at meetings and being involved with families, again, gives that extra weight to the fact of the importance of attendance. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. There's a cross-phase sharing of good practice. So, for example, our secondaries adopting similar morning meet and greet as our primaries do. Our primaries adopting a more structured graduated response to our secondary. So where we've got pockets of good practice, they're not just sharing it across secondary to secondary, we're trying to facilitate that across phases. During the pandemic, it's been a little bit informal, but we're looking to make that a more of a structured, more formal process as we come out of some of the I feel like I should have put this first, really, because this is probably the most important, is that there's a holistic pupil-centred approach. Pupils feel valued, they feel listened to. There's talk about what's it like to be a pupil in our school? Is it a place that they want to be? Is it a place that they want to come to? That's got to be first and foremost. And there's a culture of support and positivity, again, amongst all staff. The questions are, how can we help you come to school more often? How can we help you be on time more often? I've put in brackets there. Generally, pupils and parents know that they have to be in school, that we don't need to tell them that. If we take that collaborative approach, that has more of an impact. Positive and improved attendance is celebrated. So not just pupils that are achieving 100% attendance or 98%. somebody who has not been in school for 18 months and manages to attend for half, has got 50% attendance, is still celebrated, because that mileage and how much they've improved is just as significant. And we're mindful of the impact of the language that we use. So if a pupil's been off and returned to school, it's good to see you back, not why have you been away, to turn that into a positive. The punitive approach is absolutely a last resort, because experience teaches us that it doesn't promote sustained improvement. Where we've taken statutory action, quite often those pupils again fall back into poor habits of attendance, and quite often it breaks down those relationships with family. So we do follow statutory procedure, we do it, but it's absolutely as a last resort when we've explored all other avenues. Could I have the next slide, please? So again, at a school level, we've done some really thinking outside, what I call thinking outside the pandemic box. So we've had real buy-in from schools to be proactive in supporting attendance. And one of our priorities that we've pulled out in terms of looking at our persistent absent pupils are those that are suffering from high levels of anxiety. This is both at primary and secondary level. And how are we supporting those families that are on a 2-year waiting list for external support? We've sat back and said, morally, we need to be doing something. And even though some of the strategies that we've put in place are very, very resource heavy in terms of human resources, they are things that we have implemented. So we've implemented bespoke phased returns with the aim of making that return sustainable. And I need to exercise a little bit of caution here, because obviously there is some caution around putting pupils on reduced timetables, and that's usually for a very short period of time with a view of being back to school within the minimum amount of time. And we have pupils where we have not been able to do that because their levels of anxiety are so high. They've been out of school for a very long period of time, which is why we've called them a phased return. Some of that is involving remote links with peers. So if I could give an example of one of the pieces of work that we've trialled in one of our schools is where we've got, I'm going to say he because it does tend to be at the moment, and I'm not trying to gender stereotype, but there is a demographic that it is our boys that seem to be suffering with more mental health issues than the girls. So this is where parents are engaging with us, and the pupil's not managed to come into school because of anxiety, and she's saying he's at home, won't come out of his room. So we were asking the coach, what's he doing in his room? So she said, well, he's talking to his friends. His peers are in school and attending, and they are pupils that are in our schools. And he's talking with his friends on the PlayStation over his headset. I was like, right, that's great. Let's embrace that. So what we've tried to establish is a remote link, so we're building a bridge between home and school. He's still sat in his bedroom. His peers are talking to him at lunch and break time through a virtual platform in school. So they might not necessarily be talking about school. We've done some work around risk assessment, safeguarding, parental consent, and boundaries about how they can be talking to each other and what they're talking about, and that being facilitated by an adult in school. Very slow process. The next step from that is then inviting him into somewhere in school to have that break or lunchtime with his peers. Again, not going to lessons. So very, very gradual phased return at the pupils' pace. And I think it's things like that, getting that support from senior leadership teams, from schools, from staff, to be able to facilitate that kind of return. And we have got one pupil now, as an example, who is now back in school. I would say full time. He has odd days where he's, having blips, because we're not expecting him to be perfect after being out of school for nearly 18 months, and on track to achieve his predicted GCSE grades. And we've got other pupils at very similar stages of those kinds of process of being on a very slow phased return. One of the other things we've looked at doing in terms of mental health is establishing internal pupil support groups. And this is born out of a conversation I had with one of our pupils in our secondaries, talking to her, and she said her anxiety was worsened because she felt coming to school was easy. And I sat and thought, there are 3 other people in your tutor group who are having the same conversation with me. And again, there was some work around, you know, talking to those people individually. How did they feel about talking to each other? So that is also something that we're looking to facilitate. So there's some kind of internal support for those pupils that are struggling. We still do try to involve our external agencies. This is not a instead of, this is, we can't leave them at home for 2 years trying to get them back into school, because the longer they're out, the harder it's going to be to get them back into school. And even if it's in terms of, that's facilitated in our safe and well checks with those pupils, but we are building those bridges in terms of school becoming a little bit more of the norm for them. Could I have the next slide, please? Also, in terms of the pandemic, there's been a review of staff roles and responsibilities within schools. Again, because managing attendance has become an ever-expanding job in schools. So form tutors, progress leaders, SENCOs, pupil premium leaves being given more responsibility for improving attendance. In actual fact, in terms of our EHC children, which also seem to have high levels of anxiety making attending school difficult, our SENCOs are amongst some of the staff that know those families and those pupils well. So we've engaged them in the process as well. We've sat back and looked at some of the pre-COVID measures that we had for reaching our hard to reach families, and trying to reinstate some of those strategies as, you know, as restrictions start to loosen, as it were. And again, support from schools in not taking statutory action. One of the cases we had, a case study, was the parent was absolutely petrified that we were going to take action and she was going to end up in court, but trying really hard to work with us. But what she was doing was going home and saying to the pupil, if you don't go to school, I'm going to end up being taken to court. And there was a very bold step that we took in saying to her, as long as you are working with us to facilitate the phased return to school, we will not take statutory action against you. And that alleviated her anxiety, which in turn alleviated some of the anxiety that the pupil was feeling. Again, quite a bold step and quite a bold decision to make, but sometimes that risk taking has a positive impact. And he's another pupil that we are managing to get back into school. You know, we're on a journey, we're not quite there yet, but he is actually coming in through the front door, which in some cases is a massive achievement for that pupil. Could I have the next slide, please? We're used to it. In working schools is about measuring impact. And this is my personal opinion, that it's going to take a time to measure impact on overall attendance, especially in our current landscape. We have a number of children who will remain pupils. I'm very conscious about calling our secondary pupils children, who remain PA for the remainder of this academic year, even though they may have a significant improvement in attendance. For example, those pupils that may have improved from 0 to 20% or from 20% to 70%. So our schools are keeping a log of the number of pupils that have persistent absence and how many have had improved attendance. So, for example, we might have had 20 pupils not attending at all at the start of the academic year, and now 18 of them have returned with varying degrees of success. And I think this way of looking at our data gives us a better picture of that impact, whereas simple persistent absence figures won't necessarily do that. Could I have the next slide, please? So we have our own next steps. We are continuing to review our attendance policy to make it more parent friendly, being explicit in terms of the number of days and reasons when leave of absence will be granted. Some of these are pre-COVID things that we have noted that obviously during the pandemic have put a little bit on the back burner. To develop a more consistent trust-wide transition process in gathering information at both nursery and year 6 transition points in terms of addressing historic poor attendance. So as we gather data on, you know, special educational needs, but do we gather data on, has this pupil got a history of poor attendance? What does their attendance look like now? And then putting strategies in place so that that attendance is tackled early on So our year 7 pupils could be in the first half term. If they've gone off and they've had a history of poor attendance, are we tackling that or being proactive? Our nursery children going into reception. Again, we try to instill the ethos that attendance is managed in the same way, regardless of whether pupils are of statutory school age or not, across our trust, because we're forming habits, lifelong habits. So pupils at nursery and families, it's our ethos that when they come into reception, their attendance is high. And again, from our year 6 to year 7s. We're reviewing how we can further support our families with mental health issues where there's a lack of quality external support. And I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge for us. And continue to quality assure, so carrying out attendance deep dives in schools, just as we would for a curriculum subject. We'll go in and dig down, and again, it's very much a collaborative process, done with, not done to. We managed to carry out one deep dive in our schools and hope to do that across the trust as well. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, I think that's everything. It's over to Will to host the Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Michelle. Thanks very much for that presentation. We've had lots and lots of questions in from the chat, so I'll pull out a few. I think we've got kind of 5 or 10 minutes left on this webinar, so I'll pull out a few of the kind of key ones and I'll group together some that I think have come up multiple times to put to you. So the first really was about the work that you do to engage parents, particularly parents that aren't necessarily engaging with the school, whose children are persistently absent, who aren't perhaps answering the phone, aren't answering the door. Are the kind of specific strategies that you put in place working with such families? Yes,
so there will always be a pocket. We will never get 100% success rate, although that's what we strive to achieve. I think persistence is key. I think sometimes, letters will go out to parents saying we want to help and support, and quite often a letter to a parent they will see as quite official. It goes out on headed note paper, and actually sometimes if I can manage to strike up a conversation, and I appreciate that this doesn't always work. One of the strategies that we have used is if a pupil is in school sporadically, is that we still do our first day calling and all those procedures, but when the pupil has returned to school and is in school for a day, that is when we will phone the parents, because invariably they will answer the phone because they think there's an issue, the pupil's all needs collecting from school, and that enables us to strike up that conversation. And it's a little bit of walking the talk, so you're actually communicating that we want to be supportive. We're not making any judgments, we're here to help. So we have cases where that works. We have cases, we are going out, we are trying to do home visits. We try to use other avenues. So when parents are in for, they might be coming in to view pupil work or something like that. And this is again where the pandemic has made this really difficult, is actually perhaps not even talking to them about attendance in the first place, but just forming that relationship and say, oh, it's really nice to see you in school. Tell me about, and sometimes we have to take a step back and go a little bit slower to form that relationship. In terms of where we are not getting any contact at all and we can't engage, we've made no contact, then we do follow the process of reporting those children to the local authority as missing. And we acknowledge, however much we strive to engage, there will be those pockets of parents and families that we won't get engagement from. We don't give up, we are persistent, but it is very much about relationship building. And sometimes it might not be me that does that. There might be, we might have a discussion as a school about, well, actually, who had in the past got a good rapport with that family or with that pupil, and we engage that person to take those first steps.
Excellent, thank you, Michelle. That's helpful. There've been a set of questions actually about the data that you use for target setting and how you've gone about that as a trust and for your school. So it would be helpful if you could just say maybe a little bit more about the process that you go through for that.
So the target setting is all done from national data. So the last set of non-COVID data was 2019, and that is the data that we've used to target set. Where we have pockets where we were above national, we haven't set to be in line with national 2019, because that obviously means that we've taken a bit of a hit. So some of that, where I've sat down and analysed, if we were above national, it was to be in line with what we were as a trust at the end of that year. So that is entirely based on national and where we were as a trust at the end of that year. And in terms of schools, we target set for them to be at least in line with national. Again, if they were above national, we're not asking them to regress at all. It will be where they were as a school at the end of that year. That answer the question?
I think so. Yeah, thank you, Michelle. There's another question here, and quite a few actually, I think, about specific approaches to improving the attendance of specific groups of children, and if there are kind of different things that you do, say for children with an education, health and care plan, children, pupil premium funding, and how you use that for different groups of children, and how you kind of look at, think about and improve the attendance for different cohorts.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we talk about cohorts. So this is two layered for me, and I still very much work on the approach that is it's quite bespoke to the pupil, because even if we talk about EHC children, they all have differences. But when we're trying to look at it as a trust, I suppose it's about schools reflecting on best practice. That actually, if you've got if it is our EHC children, for example, that are struggling to attend, have we looked at our provision? Have we made those reasonable adjustments to the school environment? Is our provision right? Is our staffing right in terms of being able to support those pupils? So that would be the first port of call in terms of looking at them as a cohort. But then we would dig deeper into that and look at individual pupils, because actually, as a school, and I'm speaking very generally, I do feel that our provision for our EHC children is appropriate, and schools are making those adjustments as necessary. And what is impacting on us at the moment is the mental health. So that, and the same for our pupil premium children. It will be, very similar, looking at their provision. Schools have used their pupil premium funding where parents are having difficulty with morning routines and getting pupils into school. Actually, they've designated a member of staff who might help and support parents in terms of implementing those morning routines, doing a workshop with them, or even going into the home to support. Or they're saying, well, actually, what they've found is if they come in for breakfast club, they're happy for they can get them into school on time for breakfast, which is earlier than the normal of the earlier than the usual start time for school. But schools have found that that's worked, because obviously it's a meal that the parents are not needing to buy, so those children tend to be in on time. So again, I think there are overall strategies, but that is perhaps schools investigating themselves what those barriers are and directing their resources to overcome those barriers. So as I said, the breakfast club is one thing that's worked particularly well in one of our schools. Yeah. But very much then unpicking it to down to a pupil level, which I know is time consuming, but that tends to be what has the most impact.
That's helpful, thank you, Michelle. There's quite a few questions in here. They've not all been published in the chat, and there's lots still coming in, which is about your kind of rewards, your sort of rewards and the way in which you celebrate good attendance without penalising children, and how do you walk the line between celebrating excellent attendance without.
So that is very much at a school level. So that's where schools retain their levels of autonomy. Again, because reward systems work differently. Each school has its own context, but it's very much, I suppose, the kind of the thread that runs through all of our schools is about, sometimes it's just a language. Actually, it's really nice to see you back in school today. I'm really pleased that you've been here all week. It's been great to. I do put a little bit of a caveat in that, because some of our pupils that suffer from anxiety do not like that attention on them. So again, this is where your consistency and your communication across all staff. So if you've we've put a policy in place that actually pupils are welcomed back by saying, well done, it's great to see you, we've missed you. If we've got a pupil that's going to make everything come unravelled, we need to communicate clearly, please don't do that with this particular pupil. So in terms of celebrating, I suppose, rather than rewarding attendance, you know, again, it's about the language that we use and how we're approaching that. But in terms of actual rewards, that is at a school level. But we do stipulate that we are rewarding improved attendance, not just high. But how schools do that, that's up to them, because then, I think that's nice for them to retain their own autonomy and be creative in how they do that.
Excellent, thank you. There's been a flurry of questions as well about term time holidays and whether your trust has a kind of position on the way in which you deal with term time holidays and how you respond to those requests.
Term time holidays are unauthorised and we issue fixed penalty notice. This is one of the things that we're going to make clearer in our attendance policy across the trust, because obviously guidance says about exceptional circumstances and at the discretion of the head teacher. Our feeling is that there is very few exceptional circumstances when holidays would be granted, and it's again working with our teams. Quite often what will happen is that schools will refer back to me whether, if they feel unsure whether it is exceptional circumstances as well. Invariably it's not authorised, and I think, potentially to some people that could sound quite harsh, but again, I think it communicates our ethos that attendance at school is, is statutory for a start, but also it's important, it is important, emotional well-being, outcomes for pupils. So that is the very simplistic answer. We take the hard line on it, basically.
Thank you, Michelle. I think, although there are still questions that are being asked here in the chat, we're probably out of time now in terms of taking any more questions. There have been questions about, are we happy to circulate the slides, and we'll discuss that separately, Michelle, but if you're happy, then we can send the slides around to everyone who's attended. And lots of interest as well in script and kind of the different materials and letters and things that you use in your trust. So again, if you're happy, we'll maybe find some way of finding a means of kind of distributing that set of things that you use within your trust. And then Isaac, I think there was one more slide that we were intending just to touch on very briefly. I think that people will be aware, will have seen the message that has come out about the attendance data trial that we are currently looking at, that we're rolling out for all schools. So we're encouraging all schools to agree to share attendance data with the department via WAND. And really, we're trying to automate that data collection process in the future to reduce burdens on schools in having to kind of submit that data on a regular basis, but also with the kind of longer term intention of being able to share that back with schools and possibly giving a kind of more up-to-date live picture of what national and regional attendance data is showing. So would encourage you to sign up to agree to providing your attendance data if you haven't already done so. And there are various links there in the side which set out, rather in the slide here, which set out kind of further information about this trial, including a question and answer document that we can circulate to everybody on this call too. Again, if you've got any questions about that attendance data trial, if you can send them across to support@wand.com, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, we'll send out the links and everything else that we've discussed as part of this presentation. And that just leaves me to thank Michelle and also to thank Mike for delivering a really interesting, insightful presentation on what they do. And if you're interested in signing up for more of these webinars, then please follow the registration links in the side. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. And we've got 2 more webinars next week, so we'll see you there if you register for those. Thank you.